as soon as the smoke cleared from Hampton Roads on March 9th, John Erickson was lobbying to have more monitors built. We know that the monitor had numerous flaws. However, Congress had already appropriated millions of dollars to build more ironclads. They didn't know what type they would build. However, Erickson, using some of his political knowledge and also worked with Gustavus Vasa Smith, or Fox, excuse me, Gustavus Vasa Fox, and he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And so he was a big fan of these monitors. And so he pushed the contracts. First it was for 6 new monitors, and then it totaled 10 monitors. Now the Passaic class, as it's called, is basically just like the monitor, except it is much bigger. It's 200 feet in length. That's 29 feet longer than the monitor. It has Martin water tube boilers, which are better boilers than what was originally placed in the monitor. And as we look at the ship, the biggest thing from an armament standpoint is that they were armed with 15-inch Dahlgren shell guns. Now, what difference does that make? Well, Gustavus Fox, when he's at Hampton Roads, he sees 11-inch, Dahlgren shot bounce off the side of the Virginia. So he says, well, we got to have something better. So he goes on Fort Monroe, and there on Fort Monroe is the 15-inch Rodman land-based siege gun that was basically a very powerful gun. And so he said, I want those Rodmans. And Dahlgren says, well, I can make one. And so basically to have a bigger caliber, shell gun or rifled gun, you have to be very careful about how you cast it. And so they have an inner core put in, and then they cool it with jets of water so that it adheres, and then they heat it again to put, in the case of a rifle, a band on it. In the case of a Dahlgren, John Dahlgren had already figured out how to maintain the stresses within the barrel itself when it fires. This is real critical because you're in a little turret, and here you got this big gun. I got to tell you, that gun weighs 49,000 pounds. So you can well imagine this huge gun in the turret of a monitor, which is only 21 feet in diameter. So this is a crowded space, and they don't want guns to blow up. So West Point Foundry and Fort Pitt Foundry will make these guns. They're a rush order. In fact, Dahlgren, because how they fit in the turret, had to make a short 15-inch because as seen in this drawing, that you see the gun and you don't see the muzzle coming out. That's because it couldn't fit through the porthole. So they had to make it flush. So they had to build a smoke box around it. Now, this is extremely important for the well-being of the crew because all these gases that are from the propellant are going to be needed. Now, also what's improved with this monitor is, or the Passaic class, is going to be the funnel. The funnel doesn't actually look exactly like this variation, but it's called a shot-proof funnel, and it's actually made of 4 inches of iron plate that taper up to the top of the smokestack. So that means one of the problems during battle, see, the original monitor had their smokestacks flush and then they bring them up. However, during heavy seas, that meant water came in and the fires go out. So this is trying to stop that from happening. So this is a huge improvement from a standpoint of how well the ship's engines operate. And also, if you think about the Battle of Hampton Roads, the CSS Virginia, it had its funnel so perforated from shot that they said a flock of crows could fly through unimpeded. Wow. So that's why we have that. Another major improvement is going to be the pilot house. And so, You can see how it sits as a tower above the turret itself. One of the big problems during the Battle of the Ironclads, the Monitor had difficulty actually telling the crew what to do because the pilot house was at the bow of the vessel. So they moved it to be on top of the turret. In practice, this was not a good thing because it was kind of like something we could shoot at. And even though it only had 8 layers of 1-inch iron plate, Worden was in the pilot house during the Battle of Charleston, and a shot actually dents the pilot house, sending bolts inside. So that's not a good thing. And so this is improved from a standpoint as a draft of 11 feet 6 inches. It is also has the same engine system. They moved some of the things in it because the Monitor had a fire, because the shot and shell and gunpowder was located next to the galley, which is bad. So you can see where they put the shells in the forward of the ship. So they try to make it more seaworthy, but it's almost impossible to make an ironclad seaworthy. Now there are 10 Passaic classes built, and those Passaic classes were all named for Native American tribes, believe it or not, or words. Like Weehawken means rocks that look like trees, and it's a Native American. Catskill is a Dutch word, however, it meant the Indians, Native Americans, play lacrosse. And so, wow, but all these names have, Native American attributes. Folk etymology kind of proves it in many ways. However, one of the ships is going to be named the Camanche. It is not a Eastern tribe or a Mideast tribe. It is one that is in the Western Plains, and it is named the Camanche. And to tell you more about the Camanche in an in-depth fashion, I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Robert Bailey.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Julia, for inviting me to come here and share this amazing story about the USS Camanche. I'm from San Francisco, and I had been a civil engineer for the first part of my career. And one of the buildings that I became very familiar with in San Francisco was the old San Francisco Mint at 5th and Mission, built between 1865 and 1874. And one of the things that I encountered in that building was a really unique seismic resistance system. And it was through kind of unraveling the mystery of this seismic resistance system from the 1860s that I came to learn about the Camanche, because the architect engineer who designed the Mint was inspired by naval architecture. And in particular, I believe he was inspired by these monitors. And so, as we know, John Erickson, as John mentioned, was the designer. And in order to understand why there was even an ironclad brought to San Francisco, we need a little bit of historic context and project background. California, in 1848, they discovered gold. It became known as the Golden State or the El Dorado State, and it became the 31st state of the Union on September 9th, 1850. A decade or so later, Abraham Lincoln becomes president, sworn in on March 4th, 1861, as the 16th president of the United States. A few weeks later, Civil War commences on April 12th, 1861, when Fort Sumter in Charleston was attacked. Now, 12 days later, that news reaches San Francisco. So there was a lag time between getting news from the East Coast to the West Coast. So, like many projects, many things in life, you need to follow the money in order to understand the Mint, or the Mint and the Camanche. So prior to the start of the Civil War, there was the main Mint in Philadelphia, that was headquarters, and then branch mints in Charlotte, North Carolina, Dahlonega, Georgia, New Orleans, Louisiana, and San Francisco. After the war started, they were down to 2 on the Union side, Philadelphia headquarters and San Francisco. And San Francisco is where a lot of gold and silver was still being mined in the 1860s. And it was being assayed, refined, made into gold bars and coins, and then shipped east. And it was financing the Civil War to a large extent. Twice a month, steamers would go out of San Francisco to Panama or Nicaragua, loaded with gold and silver, being transferred to steamers on the other side and up to the East Coast. In 1860 alone, there was $41 million worth of gold and silver. In 2020 dollars, that's $1.3 billion. Now, prior to the Confederacy attacking Fort Sumter, they actually seized the mint in New Orleans on February 18th. So this just illustrates twice a month ships were leaving San Francisco between August 1863 and February 1864. This just gives you an example between $1 and $2 million twice a month. It was a lot of money. San Francisco was still the Wild West. This is the financial district in the 1860s. They were still lassoing wild hogs. So California politics. At the start of the Civil War, our governor was a fellow by the name John Gately Downey. He was an Irishman by birth. He married a local woman of Spanish ancestry, Maria de Jesus Jacinta Guirado y Urquidez. Following Downey, Leland Stanford was elected governor, and this was the same time that we had finally settled on Sacramento as being the location of our new capital, and it was under construction during the Civil War. Now, one of the interesting things that could have affected the outcome of the Civil War and California's fate to a large degree was some legislation that was submitted by Don Andreas Pico. He was a California state senator. He was a chivalry Democrat, and in 1859, February, he submitted what was called the Pico Bill to divide California into two states. And so it was debated, voted upon by the state legislature, approved, and then signed off by the governor, and it went to Washington, D.C. for debate and vote. What intervened was the Civil War. So that prevented, in a sense, the partition of California back then. One of our senators from California back in Washington, D.C. that was helping lobby for California was a fellow by the name of Milton Slocum Latham. He happened to be serving on the Committee of Military Affairs and Militia. Our other representatives, Senator James Alexander McDougall and Congressman Frederick Ferdinand Lowe, Timothy Guy Phelps, and Aaron Augustus Sargent. So California sided officially with the Union at the start of the Civil War, but it was very much divided internally. There were Union supporters and Confederate sympathizers, and they clashed on a regular basis. Even here on July 4th, 1862 in San Francisco, they had a big confrontation. So at the start of the Civil War, the West Coast of the United States and the entire Pacific were basically protected by the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron. There were 6 ships, some just sail-powered, some a combination of sail and steam. St. Mary's, Saranac, Cheyenne, Wyoming, the Shubrick, and the Lancaster. And we had fixed gun batteries as well. Fort Point, where Golden Gate Bridge is now, Fort Alcatraz, and then Angel Island. And they were under the command of Colonel Rene Edward de Russy. These are some of what they looked like back then, photographs looking out towards the Golden Gate, the actual guns. This is Fort Point. One of the interesting things about Fort Point that I found was that it's been built between 1853 and 59. The original drawings were signed off by Secretary of the War, who happened to be Jefferson Davis, who actually approved the funding as well as the drawings. More images of Fort Point, Fort Alcatraz, and then even on Angel Island. So one of the incidents that happened during the war was on March 15th, 1863. There were some Confederate secessionists who put together a plot, and they basically purchased a ship called the J.M. Chapman, fitted it up with guns, and got a crew together, and were going to sail down to Southern California and lay in wait for these treasure ships. Fortunately, the captain that they hired got drunk the night before, blabbed the plot to the authorities, and they went out and they arrested Asbury Harpending, who was the ringleader, and then also his accomplice, Alfred Rubery, and their crew. This is all written about in a book that was published in 1993 called The Barge and the Buckshot. But interestingly enough, in 1967, Hollywood decided to base a Confederate plot in San Francisco featuring Roy Orbison, who they had just signed to be one of their lead actors, and it was called The Fastest Guitar Alive. It was Roy Orbison's first and last Hollywood film. So the Confederate States Navy Yards. At the beginning of the Civil War, they had Navy Yards of their own: Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and even up in Memphis, Tennessee. But they are also purchasing ships from overseas in Europe. There were Confederate ships being built in Clyde, Scotland, and Liverpool was known as the Dixie of England, and it was the Laird Brothers shipyard. And 3 infamous ships on the Confederate Navy became well known on the West Coast: the Alabama, the Florida, and the Shenandoah. And they were depicted in paintings in subsequent years, and they pretty much had a search and destroy mission. They were going to cripple the whaling industry and the merchant marine industry and try to strangle the Union. Now the British They had signed on May 13th, 1861, a proclamation of neutrality. It was signed by Queen Victoria. However, the companies began to outfit ships to run the Union blockade where an estimated profit of 700% could be made. So there was a really large financial incentive for the British to be providing ships and armaments to the Confederacy. And they were actively following the events in America during that time. They were writing about them in the Illustrated London News. They could go into a reading room and get the newspapers and find out what the developments were. I came across this article. It said the British steamer Anne was discovered by a United States frigate and gunboat under the guns of Fort Morgan, Mobile Bay, unloading arms and gunpowder for the Confederacy. And the Alabama was depicted in a number of renderings, and here's the captain. He was Raphael Semmes. He was known as Old Beeswax. Another article that was published in the Illustrated London News says the Confederate steamer Alabama has captured 8 more American vessels and destroyed them all but 2. And the Alabama really got around. Here is an article from 1864. Ship Wild Pigeon from Hong Kong reported great damage to American shipping in Chinese waters by the Anglo-rebel pirate Alabama. And he was also in Mexico in Matamoros. And then one of the other Confederate ships that was well known was the Shenandoah. And they didn't really get news that the war had ended until several months after it had officially ended on April 9th, 1865. They were a ship that was originally the Sea King, had been renamed the Shenandoah. In February 1865, they were down at the Williamtown's dockyard in Melbourne, Australia, getting repairs and provisions. And it was under the command of James I. Waddell. And this is just a map showing when they had left England and traveled south past Africa, across the Indian Ocean, up the western Pacific to Alaska, and then down. And each place where there's a red oval and flames indicates a whaler or a merchant ship that they encountered and sunk and destroyed. And the Australian newspapers were making their way to the west coast, and so there was an article about the Shenandoah from 1865 April. It says, vessels destroyed by the Shenandoah. The Melbourne papers give a list of American merchant vessels destroyed by the pirate Shenandoah after leaving the Cape of Good Hope as follows: the Alma, Charter Oak, Godfrey, Susan, Lizzie M., Stacy, Edward, and Delphine. And even Waddell, towards the end of his life, he was writing his memoirs, and he says, you know, I had matured a plan for entering the harbor of San Francisco and laying that city under contribution. So it was a legitimate concern of the San Franciscans and the people on the West Coast that they might be attacked. And one of the other adversaries that the Union had to confront was Japan during the Civil War, interestingly enough. There was the Battle of the Straits of Shimonoseki in 1863. At that time, Japan was not a unified country and was still run by the shoguns and the samurai. And so in Shimonoseki, there was a battle fought between a Union vessel and the Japanese Navy. And the Union vessel was the USS Wyoming, and it was in search of the notorious raider, the CSS Alabama. But it sailed into the Shimonoseki Straits, not realizing the Japanese Navy was anchored there, as well as fixed gun batteries. There was a battle that ensued because the Japanese Navy opened up on the USS Wyoming. The Wyoming fired back, managed to sink several of the Japanese ships, and also fight its way to safety. These were the gun batteries, and it was depicted in local newspapers and subsequently, and also the Japanese depicted this battle in their own history books and paintings. Now, closer to home to California, the French-American War between 1861 and 67. The French had decided they were going to invade Mexico and install their own emperor, Maximilian I, and his wife, Queen Charlotte of Belgium. And the French, which were much more sympathetic to the Confederacy. They had also signed articles of neutrality, but they weren't really honoring them because they were building ships for the Confederacy. One in particular, the CSS Stonewall, a big ironclad ship in Nantes. And so we don't want to leave the Russians out of this, and so the Russian Navy, they fortunately sided with the Union, but they weren't going to take an active role during the Civil War, but they sent their Atlantic Squadron to New York City. They arrived on September 24th, 1863, and the Pacific Squadron to San Francisco. They arrived in October 12th, 1863, under the command of Admiral Popov. San Francisco welcomed the Russians. They were glad to have them there, and they threw them a huge, very expensive party. One of the interesting things going on at this time was the Russians had also procured a set of drawings for the Passaic-class monitors and were building their own. And one in particular was called the Veshun. And similar to the Comanche, it was manufactured in one shipyard, and then it was taken to another shipyard for assemblage. So it was actually manufactured by a Belgian firm of Cockerell in Belgium, and then taken to St. Petersburg, Russia, where it was assembled and then launched. The Russians were designing their own ships. This was one of the most interesting ships, with a round hull and plan and 6 huge propellers and steam engines. And this is how it was depicted in some of the newspaper renderings. Now back to our story. Hampton Roads, we all know on March 9th, the epic battle between the Monitor and the CSS Virginia. News of this reached San Francisco 5 days later, so it was a bit faster, fortunately. So what came of this, as John mentioned, was the second generation of monitors, the Passaic class. Just getting back, quick review. On the West Coast, we just had 6 ships that were protecting the entire western coast of the United States, as well as patrolling the Pacific and having encounters with other adversaries over on the other side of the Pacific. And San Francisco never developed the next kind of interim type of ship that was being used on the Mississippi, these modified timber hold ships. But we were going to get our own Passaic class monitor, which were being depicted in the newspapers at that time, so people were aware of what was coming. And there were 10, and the 10th one was going to be called the USS Camanche. The contractors were Donahue, Ryan, and Secor. It would be built in Jersey City, New Jersey, and then shipped to San Francisco. It had the new modified hull design that was more stable. It had several improvements, which John covered. I won't cover them now. And they had discussed several options, but the one that they settled on, they'd build it in the East Coast, assemble it, make sure everything went together, disassemble it, pack it into a clipper ship, and ship it around Cape Horn. So the shipsmiths went to work. So who were these 3 guys, or 3 entities that formed a partnership for this project? Because there was only one bidder for the US Camanche. It was Donahue, Ryan, and Secor. It was Peter Donahue, James T. Ryan, who both came from San Francisco, and then the Secor brothers. So it was really the Donahue brothers who were serial entrepreneurs. There was Michael, Peter, and James Donahue. They originally had been born in Scotland of Irish parents. The family immigrated, settled in Paterson, New Jersey. During the gold rush, they came out, they established a blacksmith shop, and then it grew into the Union Iron Works. This is what it looked like back then. Down on First Street, they advertised in the annual directory. And today you can see some of their work still, these cast iron storefronts. This is up in Victoria, British Columbia. After they got the Union Iron Works going, they decided they'd establish a gas company. So they built a whole gas producing facility. Okay.
We're going to go past 1 o'clock, so
Okay.
breathe,
Okay.
slow down, because you're doing great. So.
All right. There we go. So the Donahue brothers, the serial entrepreneurs. Yeah, I just have a lot of information I'd like to share with you all. But so they were also designing and building boilers and engines for steamships on the West Coast. Up in Mare Island, there's a big shipyard, and they were actually doing some ship construction there. This is when they had delivered an engine and a boiler for the steamship Saginaw. They also got contracts from the U.S. military for building, fabricating cannons. And then if that weren't enough, they went into the hotel business because they wanted to build a world-class hotel in San Francisco in 1861. It was called the Occidental Hotel. And they were designing and building steam engines because railroads were coming to California. And they were also making a lot of machinery for the mining industry. So Peter Donahue was a very successful businessman, and this is a home he built down on 2nd and Bryan Streets. It was a big Victorian home. It was filled with all the expensive things that he could purchase. And per the 1860 census, when he was only 36 years old, he had total assets that he listed of $400,000. That was a lot of money back then, still a lot of money now. In 2019 dollars, that's about $12.373 million. So he's a wealthy guy. So did he need to take on another project? Well, we don't know, but he did. He's commemorated in San Francisco by a monument on Market Street known as the Mechanics Monument. He was remembered during the World War II when they named a Liberty ship after him. So the second member of our partnership of Donahue, Ryan, and Secor was James Talbot Ryan. He was a neighbor of Peter Donahue. They knew one another. He was an Irish immigrant. He came from County Tipperary. His family originally immigrated to St. John's, New Brunswick in Canada, and then he moved down to Boston, became a carpenter. He also got bitten by the gold bug and came to California, arriving in San Francisco, where he had a fateful encounter with a friend of his that he met on the docks, who said, you know, I know you're coming out here to dig gold and silver, but that's really hard work and there's no guarantee that you're going to succeed. But I have another business proposition for you. Let's go up to Northern California. There's lots of redwood. They need wood in San Francisco for building homes because it's growing and it's burning down on a pretty regular basis, and they keep rebuilding. So they went up north. They established the town of Eureka, and they started a lumber business. And one of the people that he met up there who was living in Fort Humboldt at the same time was Ulysses S. Grant. They became friends. James Talbot Ryan also went into California politics. He was a state senator. In 1861, he went back to Washington, D.C. He was introduced by James Alexander McDougall to President Lincoln. And Senator McDougall said, Mr. President, this is General Ryan, a loyal neighbor of mine who can build a cathedral and preach in it, a ship and sail it, or an engine and run it. It was a glowing kind of introduction. And as we know, the day before the epic battle between the Monitor and the Virginia, there was a battle between the USS Cumberland and the CSS Virginia, when it was the Virginia who won that. And then the following day, on March 9th, was the battle between the Monitor and the Virginia. 2 days later, a delegation came down from Washington, D.C. to do a kind of a post-battle assessment. It's like, what's the future here for the Navy? Amongst the delegation was James Talbot Ryan. He had come down. So now we get to the third part. And the Secors were actually four brothers that were in the shipbuilding business along with their father, Francis. It was Zeno, Henry, Charles, and James Francis. And actually in 1864, Charles A. Secor's son, Charles F. Secor, had moved to San Francisco because he was going to help oversee the assembling of the Camanche. And the Secors had their shipyards in Jersey City. They listed in the New York City directory. And this is a picture of one of their dry docks where they were assembling the USS Tecumseh and the USS Manhattan. So one of the other sources of information about the Camanche came from the government records in the Congressional Globe, where it was mentioned by name. And back then, the typical cost of a Passaic-class Monitor was $460,000. However, the Camanche, given the complexity of getting it to California, was going to cost $565,000. In the end, it costed a bit more. It was $706,791. And news, once they had signed a contract in June 1862, news got to San Francisco via the correspondence and the telegraph that they were making progress. They were making parts, and Peter Donahue was expecting parts to arrive any day. But something intervened, and it was a sister ship of the Camanche called the Weehawken that John mentioned. It was also being fabricated by the Secor brothers in their shipyard, and it happened to be laid down before the Camanche and then launched before the Camanche. Unfortunately, it encountered some problems, and it was engine problems. On the way down, the head bolts came loose, and it damaged the engine. And so we get information about what happened in the Congressional Globe. So they said, when the Camanche was ready for shipment to San Francisco, the government took the principal parts of her engine to replace similar parts of the engine of the Weehawken, which had broken down at Port Royal, which is what they did. The Weehawken was on its way down to participate in that battle. And the engine troubles on the Weehawken and the Union government's decision to requisition repair parts from the completed Camanche delayed the departure of the Camanche to San Francisco by 4 to 5 months. This had a big impact on the fate of the Camanche. But eventually, they did get the parts refabricated. They load them onto a clipper ship called the Aquila, and they depart on May 30th, 1863, under the command of Captain James Brewer, and make their way down around South America and arrive 165 days later in San Francisco, which kind of looked like this back then. And the red dashed line and the blue stars indicate the path the Aquila took coming in through the Golden Gate and where it dropped anchor twice before it actually made its way to a dock. And so it first dropped anchor at North Point when they arrived because nobody was quite sure when they'd arrive. They went ashore to find out where should we dock. And one of the photographers in San Francisco at that time was Carlton Watkins, and he actually took a picture of the Shenandoah when it was anchored at North Point with Alcatraz Island in the background, with a Camanche in her hold still. So a couple days later, they moved the Aquila to Rincon Point, closer to the Hammond Hathaway dock where they were going to tie up and start unloading. And so one of the interesting things in the renderings from that era is they show the Hammond Hathaway dock, and there are two ships there. One is upright, the other one looks like it's listing badly and partially sunk. That's the Aquila. So what happened? They arrived on November 10th. By November 14th, they had moved to a new location off of Rincon Point, and there was a huge storm that night. It had dropped both anchors, fore and aft anchors, but the storm was so intense it dragged its anchors and collided with a British merchant ship, the Iska, who had also dragged their anchors. Minor damage was done to both ships, but they were still afloat, so they decided we better move the Camanche tie-up to the Hammond Hathaway dock, which is what they did. The following night, an even bigger storm blew into San Francisco. The Aquila was tied up, but its bow lines broke during the storm, and so it started ramming itself against the dock and knocked a hole in the side of the Aquila, causing it to sink. And so it was depicted in the newspapers showing the sunken Aquila right next to the dock. It was a real tragedy. Even a photograph was taken of the Aquila, and by this time they had cut off the mast trying to lighten the ship and right her. Now there was a problem for the contractors because the estimated value of the materials and armament was $400,000. They had only insured it for $340,000, so they were at risk for $60,000. That's a lot of money. But they went to work trying to salvage it. And they sent divers down, and the divers had gone underneath the ship and realized that the kelson and the keel had both been stove, and so it was badly damaged. It wasn't going to be an easy job. And so they tried pumping out the ship and lifting the hull with chains, and nothing seemed to be working. And they had gotten $38,000 from the insurance underwriters in New York to undertake these salvaging efforts, but it wasn't working. And even everybody in San Francisco, there was a big maritime city, were writing in, and it was being published in local newspapers, different schemes for salvaging the Aquila. One was to wrap her hull and sails to seal the damage and pump out the water. It didn't work. And finally, the Navy decided to work in concert with the underwriters. At least that's what they said. This is just a summary of arriving on the 10th and subsequent important dates. But the underwriters in New York City decided we're going to send out a professional dive crew from New York City, the Merritt Wrecking Company. And so they were going to come assess the project, and then they were going to set up a dry dock down on the end of 3rd Street. And so who came out was Captain Israel John Merritt of the Merritt Wrecking Company. They boarded a steamer, and bear in mind this is during the middle of the Civil War, with all their equipment and their crew, went to Panama, crossed over with their equipment, boarded another steamer, the Golden City, and arrived in San Francisco on January 17th. And so it was depicted in newspaper articles. And so everybody in San Francisco was very excited and somewhat relieved. They brought their equipment with them, and they assessed it, and they said, yeah, we can do this job. They knew that they had a tough task ahead of themselves because these pieces of iron were very heavy and irregular shapes. They weighed anywhere from 26 tons to 100 pounds, and they were bolted down and braced inside the cargo hold of the Aquila. They weren't just sitting there. They didn't want them to move around during that journey from New York City to San Francisco. Gideon Wells, the Secretary of the Navy, basically said, do not commit the department. So he was having a hands-off approach at this point. But the contractors went to work. They got lighters lined up so that when they extracted the parts from the cargo hold of the Aquila, they could load them onto these lighters using these hydraulic cranes and steam cranes, place them on the lighters, and then bring them over to the dry dock. So the divers went to work. There was one unfortunate accident when, bear in mind, they're down in the cargo hold of the ship. It's dark, it's murky, there's all this mud, and there were some plates that they had unbolted. They slipped and they severed the fingers off of one of the divers. Pressure was growing on them too, because back in Jersey City at the Secor shipyard, there had been a fire, and the molds that had been used to actually fabricate a lot of the parts of the Camanche, and the Weehawken for that matter, were destroyed. They couldn't easily replace them if they damaged them. So work was proceeding, and James Ryan requested a Marine Guard from the Mare Island Navy Yard. They eventually got all the parts out, and they were able to raise the hull of the Aquila as well. And the contractors had originally paid $30,000 for the Aquila in New York City before they loaded the Camanche. When they finally raised the Aquila and put her up for auction, they only got $4,900. So there was a big loss there. A local captain, Captain Sayward, purchased the Aquila, refurbished her, and put her back in service. So the salvage work occurred between January 28th and June 8th, 1864. The other thing that the contractors were very much worried about was inflation. Back then, 24.68% per year between 62 and 64. That was impacting their bottom line. And so San Francisco, they really wanted to get the Comanche assembled and launched, and so they put up $60,000. And then the contractors also went to a local banker, William Chapman Rolston of the Bank of California. He loaned them $90,000. The mayor of San Francisco, Henry Perrin Kuhn, was also backing this. He really wanted to get the Comanche launched. And the people of San Francisco were somewhat critical of Secretary Gideon Welles. They said Secretary Welles for 2 long years has been stroking his flowing beard complacently while the Alabama, that's the CSS Alabama, has been sweeping American commerce from the seas. But the Secretary of the Navy did send out an assistant inspector. M.L. Tornbone came out and he oversaw the assemblage of the Comanche. Contractors went to work advertising they needed riveters. And so they were advertising for 50 good riveters. And they set up a dry dock that's depicted here in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspapers down at the end of 3rd Street. It's basically where our ballpark is if you've been to San Francisco. And this was quite a sight for people to come see. And so crowds came down on a regular basis to watch them assemble the Comanche. And there were these photographs taken. We can see some parts of the Comanche next to that shack in the forefront. And one of the journalists who was getting his start as a journalist in San Francisco was Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. And so he was writing about the Comanche on a fairly regular basis. And when they finally did get started in July 12, 1862, they said 72 men are now employed, and during the next few days, fully 150 men will be at work, and ultimately 300. By August 30th, they had already burned through $58,000 in labor fees. But by November, they actually had the Comanche basically assembled. It was still in the dry dock. There were a lot of great photographs taken, putting on the deck plates, putting on the stocks, showing the gear for turning the turret. This is underneath the shoring, and then the propeller and the rudder. And just kind of a photo collage of those to give you an overall sense that they had finally completed the Comanche. And then they were going to launch it on November 14th, and a huge crowd of about 25,000 had gathered. About 150 people had gone on top deck. In the front there was James Talbot Ryan. And then here's the ram of the Monitor Comanche that never really saw service in a military sense during the war, but after it was decommissioned, it saw some service where it almost sunk a ferry in San Francisco when they accidentally collided. So it was a very effective ram. Here's James Talbot Ryan, and local dignitaries showed up with their wives in the top hats, and these are the skids. So the Comanche's already slid down the skid into the water, and it's floating. Everybody's very excited and relieved, and a whole crowd of people, about 150 or so, rode it down. It's still missing the turret, though, as you can see here in this photograph. And so the newspaper articles covered this. It said, finally on the 14th of November, the launching took place. It's estimated that 25,000 people had gathered. At 11:25 a.m. at flood tide, Mr. Ryan, the managing contractor, gave word. The blocks were knocked away, and in an instant, the immense weight of the vessel sent down the well-oiled ways. About 150 persons, including a number of ladies, were on deck. There was one accident that day. Unfortunately, there was a gentleman, Mr. Buckley, who was standing with one foot in a coil of rope that happened to be attached to the Comanche when it went down the skids. The rope tightened around his ankle, broke his leg, and it was such a severe injury, he ultimately died of that. But they pressed on with completing the Comanche, and here's a photograph of them assembling the turret of the Comanche before it was lifted into place and set to finally complete the Comanche. And so once it was completed, contractors wanted to get paid, and so here was one contractor who actually was a proprietor of the Comanche Saloon that had probably been set up for this project. He had provided storage space and he wanted to get paid. So after they completed it, it was time for trial trips, sign off, and delivery to Mare Island. And so one of their trial trips, they invited the Commandant of Mare Island, David McDougall. And on January 14th, they said steam for the first time was applied to the Monitor Comanche, the machinery and turret working admirably. So it was a success. On January 21st, the Monitor Comanche, with a number of Army and Navy officers and invited guests on board, made a successful trial trip to Mare Island. And they were also trying to deliver the ship to Mare Island to the Navy Yard so that they could finally get the sign-off and submit their final invoice. And David Stockton McDougall, the captain of the Wyoming, back in the Shimonoseki Straits, was now the commandant of Mare Island. And he said, well, I'd love to accept it, but I haven't gotten the official orders from Washington, D.C. Leave it here, and hopefully in a few days I'll get the orders, which 5 days later, John Lenthal, chief of the Bureau of Construction, sent a telegram saying, well, if it's done and complete, then you can accept it. So they did. And everybody was relieved. On February 11th, there was correspondence saying that, yes, it's officially done. You could submit your final invoices. So who was going to be the first commander of the Camanche? It was supposed to be Captain Salim Edwin Woodworth. And this is Captain Woodworth. He had been in the U.S. Navy during the 1840s, retired, settled in San Francisco. He was a businessman involved in politics. At the start of the Civil War, he rejoined the Navy and was assigned to be a commander on some of these gunboats on the Mississippi River, where he served for a couple of years, but he was really getting tired of that. He missed his family. He lobbied, and he was promised, yes, as soon as we get this ironclad ship completed, you will be the first captain, and you can move from the Mississippi back to San Francisco and be with your family. Things didn't work out as planned, and it was actually David McDougall who became the first commander of the Camanche. He eventually became a rear admiral. So he put together a list of the crew that he would need for the Camanche, 76 total plus the captain. This is just a summary timeline. The original contract was signed June 20th, 1862. They completed assembling it on November 14th, 1864. It didn't get commissioned, unfortunately, until August 1865, after the war ended. Within 10 years, there were needs for modifications, renovations, and repairs, and a long list was composed and put into a letter sent back to Washington. They estimated they needed $250,000 of repairs on top of what they had already spent on the original Camanche. Interestingly, there was a newspaper article that said over 60 circular openings, some of them a foot in diameter, have been cut in the deck of the Camanche and will be fitted with glass as lights. Now, one of the people who came out of retirement for those renovations was James Talbot Ryan, one of the original partners. He actually moved to Vallejo so that he could be on site, and unfortunately for him, he caught pneumonia during that time and he died. But the Camanche lived on and was seen on San Francisco Bay for many, many decades to come. In 1889, and in 1896, it was being depicted, shown in the newspaper renderings, 96 still. And this was probably from the late 1890s, and it was back in dry dock at one point up in Mare Island. And finally, the last time it was listed as a part of the U.S. Navy was in 1897. And there they noted it had been built in Jersey City, New Jersey by Donahue, Ryan, and Secor. The estimated value that the Navy placed on the Camanche at that point was $1,200. It was actually put out to bid, and there were some ironmongers who actually put up the winning bid. $6,581.25 is what the Camanche sold for. They basically took the turret off and took all the iron off. It became scrap iron for them that they could sell, and they converted it into a self-discharging coal barge, and then they sold it to two businessmen called Balfour and Guthrie. Interestingly enough, the sister ship of the Camanche, the Veshun, remember that Russian Passaic class monitor? It was stricken from the Russian Navy's list in 1900 and then also converted into a coal barge. And it was called the Barza number 44 and then the Barza number 327. Now they were advertising for selling these two large guns from the Camanche, two 15-inch guns weighing 24,000 pounds each. Also probably were sold for scrap metal. Now after it became a coal barge, it was renamed the Nanaimo, and one of the first ships that it serviced after it became a coal barge was the USS Iowa that was in San Francisco Bay at that time. Now, when it was the Nemo, this is when it had its fateful encounter with a ferry, and that ram came into play where it accidentally rammed a ferry and knocked a big hole in the side. But it was a coal barge on San Francisco Bay for many years to come. This is photos from 1906. The last photos are from August 1940 with Alameda in the background. There's the Camanche as she looked on August 1940, and she had been renamed King Coal Barge number 3. Another picture of King Coal Barge number 3 with Oakland in the background. And that concludes my talk, and thank you for your attention.
We have questions, Olivia. Do you have any from the online audience for us? And we'll let John and Robert field them as they are applied.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions here.
Was there any effort to recommission the Comanche, perhaps as a harbor defense vessel for the Spanish-American War in 1898?
It actually was part of the U.S. Navy up until about 1898, and it was basically considered one of the U.S. Navy's vessels that was protecting San Francisco Bay during the Spanish-American War. And it never really left San Francisco Bay to go out in the Pacific, but it was patrolling San Francisco Bay on a regular basis.
Is there a question in the room here? We'll alternate? No?
You said that the Russians stole the plans for the Weehawken and all that. How did they manage to get all the plans?
The Russians.
They actually
stole
purchased
the
They
them.
did purchase them.
Yeah, they were available.
Yeah, because Erickson was into making money, and
Yeah.
so, the Russians saw the monitors as a very viable defensive ship, especially in Gulf of Finland, Baltic Sea. So they bought the plans, and they produced quite a few Passaic class, as we would call them, monitors. So the real issue about a monitor is that it's a coastal defense vessel. It going to sea was not a good idea, and so that's why you see the Russians use it. The opening salvos of the World War I were fired by Austrian monitor, believe it or not, against Belgrave. So, everyone liked it. They thought it was real nifty, but it really
was
wasn't.
popular.
Olivia, another
Yeah.
online question. We'll come back to you, sir.
We do. We have a few more questions here. What were the living conditions like in cool San Francisco for the Comanche's crew?
Probably better than in other parts where it's hot and humid. And so San Francisco, by and large, is cool, and it has foggy summers, fog all year round. And so it was probably as comfortable as you could expect. And since it didn't leave San Francisco Bay, the crews were always kind of on and off the ship. They weren't on for really long extended voyages. And so they probably had it a little bit better than other crews on other Passaic class monitors.
Yes, based on complaints by various captains of the monitor, they will actually change the ventilation system, and they bring the air down through the grated turret, and so that it could come throughout the vessel. And just think, those engines are on constantly, and that produces a great heat. When the monitor is at the Battle of Drewry's Bluff, the turret alone, the temperature was 110 degrees. So, don't take me there.
No, no. Sir, you had a question here.
If I can put it back up and see. Yes, I think it's John. You had a thing on there, 1863 to 1864, approximately 15 shipments of gold went from the west coast to the east coast. Of those shipments, probably about $10 million, whatever. Did they lose any?
Not during that time period. In 1858, there was the Central America. It was just a steamship that was laden with gold that was lost in a hurricane on the East Coast. But no, they didn't lose any of those ships due to kind of piracy or any other like storms. And so most of that gold did successfully make its way back to the East Coast.
And during the war, when the ship came into the other side of Panama, usually Caribbean Sea, they had ships to escort it because they were so worried about the commerce raiders. Commerce raiders were a real threat. Having the Shenandoah sink in one day, I think it's 26 ships, was bad for the U.S. economy, and therefore that's why they wanted to rush the Comanche, and they actually send another twin-turreted monitor to San Francisco when the war is over. And that ship went around the Horn as a mini Maltov. And so.
Robert, can you repeat this gentleman's question? Those online can't really hear you all in here, so we need to revoice the question.
Sure. The gentleman asked about the shipments of gold and silver, and I had just provided a list for illustrative purposes. Between 1863 and 1864, twice a month, steamships left San Francisco loaded with silver and gold. And they published all this information. It was just in the annual directories or newspapers where they would basically list the name of the ship and the amount of gold and silver on it. So if you happen to be a Confederate secessionist and you want to know which ship it made it a little bit easier. But it was just public knowledge at that time, and it was just to illustrate the tremendous amount of gold and silver that were being sent back east.
And you know, the Monitor, when it left New York to come to Hampton Roads, they published the leaving of the Monitor in the New York Times, just like any other ship leaving that harbor. So it's like, hello, Confederates, we're coming.
We're coming, yeah. Olivia, another online question?
Yes, we've got plenty to choose from over
Okay.
here. John Connolly asked, how did monitors impact the building designs you mentioned?
Well, it impacted the design because it really is about changes to improve the Monitor. Monitor had several flaws. Not only was it unseaworthy, but also bad ventilation. It did not have powerful enough guns. It had bad visibility during combat. So they correct all those things. They correct the ventilation, they correct the funnel. They make changes based on that experience. In fact, good old Erickson is already making plans before the Battle of the Ironclads occurred. And then he gets the contract on March 17, 1862, and away they go. Those Passaic-class monitors came into service in December of 1862. So that's why it's spread out to several different shipyards.
I guess to kind of elaborate on that question, we've got a couple of more here asking about if there were changes to future monitors made
Yes.
based on Comanche.
They actually will actually create several other classes of monitors. The Contractors class. You also have the Minneophtoff class. And they make various changes. They're bigger, they have greater beam, they have better guns. One class had a 15-inch gun and then a 150-pounder rifle on board. So that was a suggestion made by John Worden. And so the Passaic class is an improvement, and each step they go, you know, they make 60 monitors during the Civil War, and some of them get taken apart at the stocks because the war's over. And so
Robert,
we-
if you had anything to add, please do.
No, that's fine. I wasn't sure whether the question had any kind of the building component, like did the design of these ironclad ships have any impact on buildings in San Francisco, which is how I became familiar with the Comanche. And it was really this, he was supervising architect of the Treasury, Alfred Bolt Mullet, who was kind of a unique individual, but his great-granddaughter is still alive, and she inherited all of his kind of materials. And I was able to meet her and ask her about her great-great-grandfather. I said, you know, when he was faced with a new design challenge, like earthquakes and seismic design, what were his sources of inspiration? And she immediately said naval architecture. He loved ships, and he always was drawing analogies between ship design and building and the buildings he was designing, especially for earthquakes. And so that was the connection when I saw kind of these iron tie rods that were in the attic of the San Francisco Mint that are very difficult to kind of understand, but you know they were original. And then when I saw the interior structure of the turret of the Monitor, it's like exactly same elements, these 2-inch diameter rods with eyes on the end and turnbuckles and the connections, and it was amazing kind of how parallel they were.
yeah, they had to re-support the turret. They actually add one of them after the Monitor was launched at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, because they realized, oh my gosh, we don't have enough stable with the turret. And so also the Passaic class has additional knees put in it and stanchions in the hull, so they give greater support to the deck. Because one of the problems when the Monitor went down to supposedly Beaufort, North Carolina, didn't make it, and the bottom, the hull, was almost coming apart. In fact, many of the crew members would say, oh my gosh, the ship is going to fall apart before it sinks. And so they reinforce that connection between the two, and they lessen the overhang. The overhang, you know, ship goes up, pops down in the waves, not a good thing. So
what ultimately became of Comanche after she was a barge? Was she eventually sunk or was she scrapped?
We don't know. That's where the mystery ends. And
Ah,
I've made lots of inquiries, and nobody seems to know whether she was sold as scrap or she just ended up in some backwater slough and slowly rusted away. But it would be wonderful if somebody accidentally came across her one day and realized, oh, there's a whole ship's hull here, and we'll hope that maybe that happens someday. But it was really the photographs from August 1940 were the last ones that I could find.
And the funny thing is, the Warrior, which is the British first seagoing ironclad, and now is restored in Portsmouth. However, it was found as a oil barge. They go, oh my gosh, this is the Warrior. And so they restored it. So you never know what happens to these ships.
Yeah, stranger things have happened. That's right. That's right.
so I may butcher this acronym just a little bit, but Paul wants to know what happened to King Cole barge number 3. Did it sink? Was it sold to another company? I think this is extending off of what you just answered. But on the East Coast, we have found sunken remains of an LST that has been converted to a barge later on. And Paul specified LCI, L in parentheses, / LCS, L in parentheses.
Well, those are landing ships.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so they made a ton of them for World War II. And so then when the war's over, just like after the Civil War, they sold them for scrap and so forth after their usefulness ends. So I have to say that there's one monitor, it's a new style monitor, and it was called the Aphrodite, and it was still floating in 1953. So that's the
Where was
longest.
that?
It was at Sandy Point in Maryland, and actually they brought it up because it was in Elizabeth City and served as a machine shop. Then they turned it into a hotel. Then they turned it back into a machine shop. Then they brought it up to Sandy Point, which is near Annapolis, and actually they thought they would build it as a hotel. And so my thought was, they're really kind of crazy, because if you're crossing the Bay Bridge, you want to go to Ocean City or back home. You're not going to stop in a non-air conditioned hotel, I'll just tell you that. You know, so it was scrapped by Patapsco Scrap and Iron Company in 1953 through 54.
Okay, we have kind of a combination question from Thomas and John about the ironclad architecture affected in the San Francisco earthquake in the building you examined. And what was it about your study on those buildings that really piqued your interest into this topic?
Well, the architect I mentioned, Alfred Bolt Mullet, he was kind of like the Stephen Jobs of his era. He was quite meticulous, and he designed everything in his buildings right down to the doorknobs and the hinges. And so nothing was left really undocumented. And when we were comparing his original drawings and specifications with the building, we found that there was great correlation. But when we got up in the attic and started crawling through these spaces that were full of ducts and dust, we came across these rods that didn't show up on the drawings, and it's like, what are they? And then it was a challenge just to map them all out, because they're brick firewalls that go from the attic floor up to the roof. And so you're only seeing a portion of these iron rods. And so you have to do a connect the dots exercise, which we did, and then realized they went from the exterior walls to the courtyard walls, and they were going in all sorts of different directions. But it kind of made sense, and then realized that in 1865 and 1868 in particular, there was a very large earthquake in San Francisco. And so a lot of people kind of gathered together and decided, what's the future of seismic design for San Francisco? And Mullet was in the middle of his design at that point. They didn't go into construction until 1869. And so that earthquake in 1868 was kind of a pivotal time in seismic design. There was no building codes back then, but people could observe how buildings behaved. And the ones that performed well, they said, what was about that building that really caused it to perform well? And those that fell apart, they knew they didn't want to do that. And Mullet realized that he was designing an industrial building. And so it was not only subjected to earthquakes on a periodic basis, it was full of machinery. I mean, mints are basically 1/4 or 1/3 front office, nice, where you interact with the public, but back of house, it's a big factory full of steam engines and belt and pulley system and the coin presses. And the first mint that had been built in the 1850s, within a few years it was falling apart because of the equipment vibrations. And so they knew they had to design a really stout building, but Mullet just took it to another level. And so they implemented all of this kind of seismic design based on their observation from 1868. And the mystery remains is, why didn't they draw it? They wrote about it in correspondence. It was written about in the newspapers. It came up during subsequent lawsuits. And so there was plenty of information there. And following the construction of the mint, Mullet designed 2 more buildings in San Francisco, the sub-treasury and then the appraiser's store. And on the appraiser's store, he actually shows these iron tie rods. And so there was a progression. And so it was just something also with the appraiser's building. It was built on what was called made ground because it was formerly San Francisco Bay that they had filled with soil. And they built the customs house on it. And it was always having problems because the soils were settling. And so, and it had been built on piles, timber piles, but it was just problematic from the very start. And when the federal government said, okay, we want to build an appraiser's store on this prime piece of real estate right next to the customs house, everybody was saying, you have to build it on piles. Mullet was, no, I'm not going to do that. Those are really expensive. He said, I'm going to build it like a ship with a big mat foundation so it's going to float on the soil. That building survived the 1906 earthquake with very, very little damage. And so his design was actually quite innovative, and it came from his kind of familiarity and his appreciation of naval architecture.
Well, we've kind of gone a little over for an hour. So all those questions that are still there, I'm sure I'll get them and I'll share them with Robert, and we'll get answers out to everyone, as we usually do.
Yes.
But
So John's email is johnkorstein@gmail.com. No, this is a different one. It's not the one that we usually put at the end, no. This is our other slide. So we did want you to have johnkorstein@gmail.com, and we will definitely share more questions because I'm sure we have some more, right, Olivia?
Yes,
And
we've
we'll
got a
definitely-
few more in the Q&A box, but we're going to record them and we'll answer
Good.
those via email.
you'll just send them to
Okay.
me, and
And June 3rd is the next, it's my birthday, in case you need to know.
what do you want, a cake? Is
And
that?
it's also the next Civil War lecture where John will talk about, I say Merrimack, you say Virginia, which ties into my final question is I see Camanche with an A and Comanche with an O. So that's much like Merrimack with a C or a CK.
That's
So
right.
you see ship names that get used both ways, but it seems like CAM is most commonly used as you did.
Yes, I
Yeah.
looked up the folk etymology
Yeah.
of every monitor's name, and it's amazing how they named the vessels.
Right.
They eventually came up with words that I can't pronounce very well. So anyway, but
Yep.
thank you all for being with us
Yeah,
today.
thank
you,
you.
Robert,
Thank you,
and
Robert.
I really appreciate everyone. And huzzah!
We appreciate you being with us, and thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.